speaking with veteran political activist, journalist, and educator Charles Simmons here at Black Star Community Bookstore. This is the second in a series of intergenerational dialogues in which we talk to veterans in our movement about their life and about their views on the current issues facing the Black community. Brother Simmons, welcome to Black Star Bookstore.
Well, thank you very much, Yakini.
Part of the purpose of this is that we want to document the lives of those veteran activists who have, I don't want to say started the movement, because certainly there were people before you, but continued the movement and were activists during the high part of our movement during the 1960s and 70s, so that we can extract the wisdom of their knowledge and experiences and pass that on to those of us who perhaps weren't involved in that. So we'd like to start by talking about your personal life, and starting with where you were born and how you wound up in the Detroit area.
Okay, I was born in River Rouge in 1941, and I spent, at that time, my father died right after, a couple of years later, and my mother was working as a domestic, and so I was being babysit by relatives in River Rouge, and then I went to Detroit, came to Detroit with my paternal grandparents, who were at King Solomon Baptist Church. Well, the activities at the church, I think, were a major influence on my life as a child, because we had, it was a Reverend Boone, his name was T.S. Boone, who was a historian in the Baptist church. He was from Texas, and he had taught at Langston and had been a sheriff, and had doctorates, all kinds of degrees, but he was an old Booker T. Washington advocate, supporter, and he was one of the Booker T. Washington Republicans in that period. One of the things that distinguished them from the current Republicans, that they were very pro-small business, and they were pro-civil rights also. So they weren't like the conservatives that we're experiencing now. Well, they brought a lot of speakers to the church all the time, and they had all the kids involved in cultural things. So everybody were reciting poetry all the time. My grandmother taught Negro history at the church.
Now this is during what
this
years
was in the
are we talking
1940s, and mainly the 1940s and early 50s.
And if I can stop you for just a minute, this is interesting, and I've already learned something very important, because many of us know that Malcolm X delivered his famous message to the grassroots at King Solomon Baptist Church, I believe, in 1963. But now I'm hearing that church had a long history
Yes, it did.
of involvement in that community, and that you yourself were rooted in that particular community. In fact, I think you still live in that community.
Yes. Now, the King Solomon wasn't located at where it is right now. Right now it's on 14th and Marquette, but
Okay,
it was on the east side, on Delmar,
Oh, I see.
in Westminster. It was a center for gospel. It was a major center for gospel music even in the 40s. So by the time we moved to the site where Temple Baptist Church, which is a white Baptist church, owned the present site, and they moved out in the suburbs somewhere and sold us this church. Now, the significant thing about the church was that they had the largest auditorium in the African American community in the 1950s when we moved there. So that was the place where all the gospel singers went nationally, and in fact they founded the National Gospel Music Association right there, James Cleveland and all those folks. So I was reciting poetry as a child, in church and in community events. It's sort of the standard procedure, and and I knew about Paul Robeson, for instance. My grandmother was really strong at it. She was a singer in choir. And I remember, this was during the McCarthy era in the early 50s. I remember when Robeson came to Detroit, I heard something on the radio critical of Robeson, and I asked I asked my grandmother what it was about. She was just very angry, and she said, they were trying to destroy him, and they're lying about him, and so on. But I didn't get the details of the background about it. But I knew that he was very significant. And so as soon as I could, I started reading about Robeson. Now another thing that was happening in our community, in the barbershop, on the tables, there would be the Chicago Defender, Baltimore, or the Washington Afro-American, you'd have the Pittsburgh Courier, and any other African American papers that they had access to, and the Michigan Chronicle or whatever we had at that time. And the men would discuss the issues in the black press. Now there wasn't much of an alternative because there was nothing in the mainstream press, in the white press. They didn't mention black folks unless we killed somebody. It was now and then they had a crime report or something about sports. But the men were quite knowledgeable about national and local events based on reading the black media, and they would discuss these things along with sports and other things that they talk about. But I thought that the level of discussion was much higher at that time than it is now. And it was during the McCarthy period, and I remember, all the men in the church practically worked in the factory. So they were all auto workers, and most of them were members of Local 600, which was sort of a militant local within the UAW that was really advocating for civil rights and stuff. And this was, like I said, in the 50s.
And were they workers at Ford Motor Company or some of the other?
They worked at all the different factories.
Okay.
But they, a lot of them belonged to that local, which was the largest local in the UAW. And so I went around with my grandfather a lot to these meetings, and they talked about the history of the union struggles that they had been in, the sit-down strikes and all of that, and how the companies hired gangsters to kill off the union leaders. And the men, they packed pistols going to work. I mean, they had shootouts with the union, with the company goons.
Company goons.
Goons.
Right.
And it was sort of...
Henry Ford, in fact, was famous.
Yes, right. And I remember once there was a discussion about communism, and somebody said, "What is this communism all about?" And there was a moment of silence, and then somebody said, "Well, I don't know what it's about, but it sure has got these white folks scared to death." But that was also the period of the nuclear scare. And, we had to get up under, they would have these nuclear drills, and we'd get up under the tables and cover up our heads and faces, and that was going to protect us from the nuclear fallout. And people had underground places to hide and all of this stuff. So people were really pretty frightened about the possibility of nuclear confrontation. So we had the McCarthy era thing. We had people going to jail for that. Robeson and others they have their passports being taken, not allowed to perform, except in Detroit. I mean, Detroit was a place where Robeson could always come and be welcome and perform. Those were the years of Joe Louis, who was our hero. When he went out, when he wanted to fight, we'd go out and bang on pots and pans and shout. I was in I went to I began high school at Chatsey in '55, and I went there because it was a trade school, and my grandmother was also Booker T. Washington. She believed that we needed a trade. Now I was playing around in class one day, and this was like I was in the 10th. I was in about the 11th grade at this time. I was playing around with some other guys in the class, just clowning, and the instructor, this was the electric shop, the instructor became angry and said, and we were all black kids who he was talking to, said, he cursed, and he said, the reason that you're here is because you're too damn dumb to do anything else. And that really stopped me in my tracks, because I'd never been called dumb before. So I rushed to the counselor and said, I want to switch to college prep. And she said, no, you can't change because you didn't pass some exam, And I didn't know anything about the exam, but I went and told my grandmother, and she put on her big hat and went down to the school board, and next day they switched me to college prep. Now I have to say something about the experience earlier with my grandparents, because my grandmother was active with the Baptist Women's Auxiliary. And they acted as social workers at a time before we really had social workers. We would often get up in the middle of the night, and they'd take myself and my sister, and we would go to somebody's house where there was a spousal conflict. And my grandfather would go off with the man, and my grandmother would take the woman in another room. And I don't know how long it would take, but when we left, there was no more fussing and fighting. And we did that on a regular basis, and I don't know how many other people were doing that. And they never even talked about it. It was just sort of a normal thing that was going on, of a way of problem solving and conflict resolution that we were doing on our own. And some of them were people who were in the church, some were people who were in the community. And I think that that's something that we need to resurrect, because the conflicts have become so large, and the criminal conflicts have become so large, and we've got to find some alternatives to dealing with, because the prison, at that time we thought of prisons as a problem, and now the country looks at prisons as a solution. So we've got to flip that and go back to finding ways of doing something on our own. Now, right after Brown versus Board of Education, Thurgood Marshall, who was still the attorney for the NAACP, he came to King Solomon and spoke, and he was on a recruitment drive, and I joined the NAACP at that time, the youth chapter. And one of the first meetings I went to, there was a debate about whether or not to expel Robert Williams from the NAACP. Robert Williams was engaged in the fight in North Carolina against the Klan. We had, that was also around the time of Emmett Till's lynching, and I was the same age as Emmett Till, and it really had a terrifying impact on me. I remember I was so outraged at that. I was 14, and I remember his mother came to King Solomon. She was on a national speaking tour, and I was sitting in front of her, just imagining myself, because many of us of that generation would go south every year to visit our grandparents or some relatives, and I would go to Georgia every summer practically. So I spent a lot of time on the farm also every year, and come back to the city. But I identified with what he had experienced, and was thinking that could have been me very easily. And so then that takes me up to the. As soon as I got out of high school. Well, the last thing I remember about high school in terms of education was we were studying about Korea, the war in Korea, which was quite recent when I got out of high school.
And you graduated?
I graduated in '59,
okay. And
the war was in the mid-'50s, 55, 56. And so I knew a number of the older, the young men who was a little bit older than me who went to Korea, my neighbors and relatives. So I had some interest in that, and I remember being taught that we had won the war in Korea, and we went there to fight for peace and justice and truth and everything, and to help people and establish democracy. And I took that with me. I accepted it. I went into the Air Force to take a trade. I really wasn't thinking we were going to be fighting anybody. I was 17 years old, and it just seemed like a good thing to do. I was going to get some education. I would get to travel and so on. So I didn't know about the Cuban Revolution going on, the Algerian Revolution, all the things that were happening in the third world countries. But one of the first experiences I had when I got into the Air Force was a discussion by Korean War veterans about their experiences in in Korea. And they were talking about how bad they got beat up in Korea and how they wanted to get out of there, and that there was so much confusion and misinformation and enormous amount of people getting killed unnecessarily as a result of this, with no at least truthful explanation of why they were there. And so I jumped in the conversation with the older guy